Welcome to the VIFF podcast, recorded on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. This podcast is a chance to hear more from the filmmakers presenting work at the annual Vancouver International Film Festival, as well as year-round at the VIFF Centre. We hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, I'm Rowan Keith. I'm part of the team here at the Vancouver International Film Festival, and today I have the pleasure of talking to Kunsang Kyirong. She is a Canadian filmmaker and artist, and we're speaking to her today about her debut feature film, 100 Sunset. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Congratulations on the film. It's absolutely stunning. I'd love to hear your kind of summary of the film.
Yeah, definitely. 100 Sunset is about a young thief who has recently immigrated to the neighborhood of Parkdale in Toronto, Canada. And while there, she early on steals a small DV camera that she uses to spy on her neighbours in this large apartment complex that she lives in called 100 Sunset. And through that spying, she meets a kind of unexpected confidant.
Excellent. And can you tell me how this film came about? Like, how long has this been in the works and what inspired you to make it?
Yeah, I started writing the script, I believe, in maybe late 2021. And in 2022, I continued while also starting to cast, especially once we had locked funding through Telefilm Talent to Watch. I was living in Parkdale, Toronto at the time, doing my master's at York University, and lived in Parkdale. So through this process of kind of writing and casting, I was able to meet a lot of the characters that are portrayed in the film very early on. So the two leads, I spent a year with them before going into production. So a lot of those kind of meetings influenced how I would start to kind of write the characters in the film.
So how come you chose to use kind of those non-professional actors, and how did they influence them in that there are similarities between their characters and the characters we see on screen, or was it more just a kind of something that came out of conversations?
Yeah, no, they definitely influence the characters that we see on screen. The two leads, Tenzin Kunsel and Sunam Chuki, who plays Passang. I spent a year with them every weekend, meeting, going for dinner, watching movies, exploring the city. And through that process, got to know the two young women. And with Tenzin Kunsel, I initially would meet her separately from Sunam, and 3 months later I kind of started to introduce them. And in real life, she might be embarrassed for me to say this, but she was very quiet even early on, like it was sometimes kind of hard to get a word out of her, though she from the get-go was interested in playing a role in this film. And then as for the secondary cast, it was very similar, where I had started meeting them 6 months prior to production, also on the weekends, getting to know them, watching films, kind of working through a bit of improv. And we really had this kind of nice dynamic and group, that we would get to kind of hang out with and talk about films before launching into a longer production.
Amazing. You can really feel that kind of community aspect that must have developed off screen come across on screen, and those kind of dynamics in the way that people interact. And it's interesting to hear you talk about kind of the development of the friendship between the two main women, and the fact that you kind of chose to spend time with them separately and then together. I think the friendship between those two is really what drives a lot of this film. And it's such a fascinating relationship to watch, because you've kind of got this like companionship in what seems to be isolation. But then you also have kind of a sense of rivalry, but also infatuation and obsession. And there's kind of almost a question mark of whether it's platonic or potentially more than that. And, there are so many different dynamics going on there. And I think we've seen such a growth in the portrayal of complicated female friendships recently. I'm wondering if there are any like film or television inspirations that you've kind of looked to for that kind of dynamic that's influenced you.
Yeah, definitely. I love complicated women and complicated friendships, and I feel like a lot of films that I'm drawn to focus on those relationships. So there were a few. There was Catherine Brier's Fat Girl, which was a source of inspiration. Love and Pop by Hideaki Anno, which visually was also an inspiration, but also how he kind of depicted this group of young girls. Also Sofia Coppola's Virgin Suicides was another film that I was focusing on early on. So there was like many different types.
And how did you want to kind of toe that line? And I guess how did you develop that friendship to combine all the many things that it ultimately comes across as on screen?
Well, I think that the film builds this larger community scaffolding, and I always wanted that to be, you know, a large part of the film. But the two young women in the script, but especially in the edit, it really made sense to bring that relationship to the forefront even more, because their dynamic on screen was, to me, quite mesmerizing.
Yes, it definitely was. I completely concur with that. You spoke about kind of having this like natural community and how that was built kind of organically. The setting of the film is also obviously such a huge part of this, particularly the apartment block, but also the restaurants they're in and the shops and that kind of thing. And then also kind of the Canadian countryside that you see as well. How did you go about finding where you wanted to shoot this?
Yeah, so throughout my teens, I had aunts that lived in Parkdale. So I was pretty familiar with the neighborhood. And in Canada, in North America, the Tibetan diasporic population is quite small. So you kind of, you know, you always know someone who knows someone. You're always quite connected. And while I was living in Parkdale, Toronto, I had already had a few friends from online when I was younger, and also kind of new friends that I was making while living there. And I would say through those relationships, integrating into the community was very easy. And when we started location scouting, a friend of mine, two friends of mine that helped with casting, Chimi Lamo, who is kind of like a Parkdale Tibetan celebrity, and also ran for city councillor, I think like 2 years ago or something. She helped with casting, helping organize with auditions in the local community center. And really, you know, if I saw someone or knew someone that I'd seen at a restaurant or on the street, I would sometimes ask her, you know, like, do you know this guy? Like, who is he related to?
Yeah.
To help to reach out. And then also I worked with Tibetan Buddhist monk Khenpo Ngawang Wusar, who also played a vital role with casting, and introduced me to Tenzin Kunsel, which was the daughter of a friend of his. And through these two individuals, also for locations, like Chimilamo's father, Ada Nimala, he helped me find households in West Lodge, which is renamed 100 Sunset in the film. So this giant apartment complex. And we would go door knocking and visit some Tibetan people that he knew that lived there. And I also had another friend, this man named Sunam Toronto, who I would also go door knocking with. And he also had a few friends there. And then in terms of the restaurants, both restaurants were restaurants that I frequented. So Shangri-La, where we start in the film and where the book ending of the film takes place, is one of the oldest establishments actually in Parkdale, Toronto. And then Songtsen, another restaurant that we shot at, the owner's name is Purbula, and I would often go there to like eat lunch and have dinner. So there was this kind of ongoing relationship that was already established. And then in terms of, you know, some of the locations, Nikolai Mikhailov, my cinematographer and dear friend, he would come, you know, to get to know these spaces very early on. And a lot of the exterior, a lot of the kind of like, you know, Huckleberry Rockhead, where we shot the scene where Passang and Kunsel, you know, are kind of going off and wandering, Nikolai and I, and my producer Joaquin Cardner would kind of drive around across Ontario looking for, you know, the right place. Yeah.
That's amazing. How did you find people reacted to the kind of door knocking? Were people excited to have this represented on screen, or were you met with any sort of resistance at all?
I think combination, you know, we got our fair share of no's, but then some families that were, you know, very generous and would give us access to their homes for multiple days, and yeah, so it was really a combination, but I think we were very lucky and met so many people that were really willing and kind of excited about the project. And yeah,
I love kind of anything that's set within that kind of apartment complex idea. I think the like relationships that can build inside those spaces are so interesting. And there's a line at the end of the film that I believe Passang's husband says, where he's like, it feels so small when you're inside and looks so large from the outside. And I think that's such an interesting perspective that I think you definitely feel from the character's perspective as well. But I think, could you talk a little bit about the choice? Because obviously the inside spaces are so kind of embedded within that community, and then the outside spaces are so distinctly, I guess, Canadian in terms of the big rocky outcrops and the snow and everything, and that kind of like almost barren seeming land. Could you talk a little bit about how you wanted to contrast those kind of inside outside spaces?
yeah. Well, firstly, I think an important aspect of the film was trying to capture this very insular nature of growing up in this community and the way that it continues to exist, especially in a place like Parkdale, where the concentration of the diasporic Tibetan community is so large. You can really kind of spend your entire life not really having to interact with people outside of the community because of the amount of people and the, you know, the resources that are kind of established, the restaurants, the drivers. Like it's, you can really just isolate yourself. And I really wanted to let audiences into what that feels like. And in terms of the contrast, I think I was really drawn to contrast, you know, between the two young women, between the landscape, the spaces. So really trying to balance that throughout the film, the different cameras that we used. So like using our Arri Alexa 35 and then also the handheld camera to create this dynamic, whether it be between the characters, between the landscapes, or the footage that we're watching as well.
Yeah, I think that brings me on perfectly. I wanted to speak about the presence of the video camera in the film. It feels, for me particularly, watching it in an era where there is so much social media, and I feel like we're very accustomed to kind of everyone, but particularly young women, recording their lives to broadcast online. There were so many films in this where the two girls were recording themselves, especially when they were kind of in the metro stations, that felt exactly like something you would now see on Instagram. And it was interesting watching it when it's set in an era where they wouldn't necessarily be broadcasting to anyone. And that camera really like lets you into their perspective. And kind of also gives this feeling of like maybe objectivity, but also subjectivity to what we're seeing. I found it interesting because obviously the film starts with a piece of footage that Gyatso has recorded of his wife, and he kind of states why he's recording it, because he wants to capture her, and the film is kind of then bookended with him explaining the meaning of having that footage of his wife to him. But we never really get that kind of explicit statement of why Kunsel is doing it. And I think, you know, from her conversation with Gyatso, he kind of is like, you need this more than me, but we don't necessarily know why she needs it, although she does like clearly go on a journey. So I guess I just wanted to ask like why you wanted to have that camera integrated and what you think it kind of like, how you use that as a tool to explore that character, I guess, or both of those characters.
Yeah, thanks for that. When I was writing the script, I really wanted Gyatso and Kunsel's character to be experiencing something similar while still being very different characters, or different people,
Yeah.
you know. And with Getzo's footage, there's, you know, he's obviously, or maybe not obviously, but his kind of life story is very different, and we get a sense of that in the truck when he expresses himself with, you know, having being trading across the border between like Tibet and Nepal, the border closing, and not being able to see his family or his wife anymore. And I wanted to draw on those similar themes and experiences with a character that, you know, is set in her day-to-day life. So something that would be true to her experience. So building, you know, the relationship and the voyeurism of Kunsel towards Passang was something that I found was similar. You know, obviously it's a development of a friendship, and the relationship is a bit different. And, you know, there are these maybe darker qualities that Kunsel has as a character, but it felt akin to Getzo and this idea of capturing what's around you, even if it is voyeuristic sometimes, and, you know, you kind of fixate on an individual because maybe there's not like a lot of other connection around. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. And I think that feeling of you know, this young woman arriving and her an uncle being like, oh, she needs friends, maybe you can be friends together, is something that's so familiar. Watching it, it's like, oh yes, like when you're just kind of the only two people that fit that demographic in a setting and you're like placed together, was just so very like nostalgic to watch, I guess, in a way. But you mentioned that there are kind of these darker qualities to that relationship, and I wanted to ask about, obviously one of the central components of what drives the plot forward is that she's a thief and is kind of stealing things from people. And there are moments in the film where that's almost endearing and a little bit humorous. And like there was like watching it in the cinema, there was a kind of a moment where she's rooting through someone's bag and everyone starts chuckling because it's just like, oh, this again. Yeah. But then there are also obviously moments where it's like, it really feels like a betrayal. And I think especially when it's related to the Ducati, which is kind of the community loan system that they all have. It feels like a real betrayal of the community. And I think that's what's so interesting watching the film, is this tension between wanting the best for these two characters that you spend so much time with and care for, but then also with, especially in Passang's case, that comes with like a cost to, like a huge cost to the community. And yeah, I guess I just wanted to kind of speak to you a little bit about that. Having that loan system as kind of this through line that almost like ties together all of the different people in the community and how their dynamics work, and this kind of like bidding system that is both like everyone's helping each other, but then there is also this like element of rivalry and competition involved. And yeah, I just wanted to hear about kind of how you chose to use that.
Yeah, I early on when I was writing the script, I went to go visit Jackson Heights in New York, in Queens, where there's also a very large, comparably sized Tibetan diasporic population and Himalayan population. And I met an old friend of mine that I hadn't seen for years, who had recently come from India. And he was telling me about the same collective money loaning system, Dukuti. And I'd simultaneously been reading this book about the first wave of Chinese immigrants to New York City working as Chinese hand laundrymen, where they had a system called Wei that had the exact same structure. So there are a lot of these immigrant communities that have these collective money loaning systems that are based on this aspect of trust. You know, there's no ramifications if someone takes off. It's only trust based. So there's a lot of precarity and kinship. And when I started integrating you know, this as the structure, because I had been reading the book and because I had visited and ran into this friend, it kind of just, you know, was this spark of, oh, of course, this should be the structure of the film. And, you know, through a lot of people that I met in Parkdale, Toronto too, it's these structures really exist. And it's funny because, a small anecdote, during the tail end of production, I think it might have been a week after wrapping, I was a part of a community WhatsApp group, and there was a clip that had been shared of a couple taking off with a large sum of money from a dukuti that was actually taking place.
Oh, wow.
And the clip was on YouTube, and it was the two faces of this couple and money emojis, and then this long voiceover statement of like who they are, where they went, what was going on. So even though it was such a, you know, heartbreaking situation, after coming off a production where, you know, the entire kind of plot revolved around this financial money loaning system, it felt a bit serendipitous in a way. Yeah.
I feel like the best gossip always comes from a community WhatsApp group.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, that's kind of an uncanny moment there. I think one thing that's interesting about it is it ties, it makes kind of the stakes of, in terms of the timeline of this film, you're talking about kind of a 10-year period for these loans. And it kind of shows that people are really like building their life around this community that exists. And, you know, throughout the film, it's kind of unclear exactly the timeline of how quickly everything is taking, and then it's kind of at the end it's revealed that it's only been, I think, a month or so since the beginning, which is just so interesting to see kind of how quickly someone can disrupt something that people have bought into for such a long period of time, and this kind of disruptive force. How do you kind of play with those timelines in terms of like looking at establishing a community within this film that has so clearly existed for so long before and will continue to exist for so long afterwards, while also creating so much intensity around something that's only happening within this kind of month-long period?
Well, I guess the setting of the film was actually 2011, around that time, because in 2011 there was a new immigration incentive for Canada where they brought 1,000 Tibetan, refugee would actually be the wrong word because in India there are displaced people, to Canada from this rural area called Arunachal Pradesh. And it was over the span of, I believe, five years that they would come in batches. So the film really references this new wave with this new young couple and also Kunsel moving to Canada. And then in terms of the timeline of, you know, all of the events that are happening, I think it's, you know, a month can feel very long when it's quite compact. And I like that, you know, at the end, this month that has kind of flickered by feels like a very quick tale of events, which is maybe something, you know, even I realized afterwards.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think there's something in there as well about the youth of these two. Like a month when you're young feels like forever, but to these kind of older generations, it's like that's the blink of an eye. And that sense of perspective of like, this thing that happens to you for a month at 17 can change your life, but actually but they're investing in something where it's like the 10-year, the lifelong impact. I found, as I kind of mentioned, it's interesting watching this it's interesting watching this kind of pre-social media setting, or I guess like maybe proto-social media setting. Now we're in the era that we're in. And I think it's kind of, there's been a few films recently, I think Lady Bird is the obvious example, but kind of this like teenagehood pre-social media and pre-smartphones. And I guess from both kind of like a storytelling perspective, obviously it makes sense within the political context, but I think there is something there in terms of like the isolation that these girls experience is a definitely different quality to what it would be now, perhaps. But also just like technically, how do you go about like making sure everything looks like 2011? It must be interesting to form what is essentially a period piece, but of a year that has happened within your lifetime and almost everyone's living memory that will be watching this film.
Yeah, we worked with an incredibly talented production designer, Diala Kawar, and, you know, a big philosophy of the production design, the costumes, you know, all of these visual elements of the film was always combining what was already present in these households with a bit of curation. So I think we, you know, it took a lot of work, and our team did, in my opinion, an incredible job. But we really tried to be specific while also maybe maintaining a kind of timeless quality, or, you know, that it's hard to grasp exactly when this film is taking place. Yeah, even though in this, you know, like actually it would, if you like, even there's like Tibetan radio stations that are playing in the background that are talking about, you know, this new wave of immigration. So there are kind of like these there's like information that's sort of pointed. Yeah
I found the use of language in this film really interesting. I think, you know, there is so little spoken English within it, and it's always kind of like a bit of a disruptive force when it happens, I guess, or at least it's just kind of something that as the audience you notice, because you're, you know, tuned into one thing and then you tune into the other, and the only person that kind of really regularly speaks English is the little girl, who's a fantastic character and so charming, but and then obviously the two main women in their English classes. And I think I found the transition from Kunsel being really kind of reluctant to speak and participate in those classes, and then through Passang kind of like getting the confidence to learn, really interesting. And I think, yeah, I guess how, in terms of both like production and on set, it must have been a very like multilingual set to work on, but also in terms of like writing the script, how did you like go about that? Did you kind of write it in one language and then insert the other, or was it kind of both at the same time?
Yeah, so on set it was definitely multilingual. Like a lot of even the Tibetan cast, some of them didn't know how to speak English. There was really some where, you know, most Tibetans are like trilingual, or, you know 4 languages, just by virtue of where they are or where they come from. So we had a few Tibetans on the production team to help with, you know, speaking and kind of getting information across. And then in terms of the script, I wrote the initial script in English, and then worked with 3 different translators. We did the first translation, and then we also had Lobsang, who plays the man with the golden tooth, and then one of our kind of like on-set art assistants also do another pass at the translation. And this all happened quite early on in the kind of pre-production phase. And as we moved closer to production, I created a triangle method where we had, you know, Tibetan text, like Sanskrit Tibetan text. We had English, and then we had transliterated Tibetan, to have these 3 versions.
Right.
Because I can read, and like a few of us, you know, could read transliterated Tibetan, but we couldn't perfectly read like the Sanskrit Tibetan. And then some individuals, obviously the production team especially, you know, would have to read English, and myself included. And then some cast members couldn't read at all. So there was also, you know, a bit of memorization that would happen during shooting, during production. Yeah.
Excellent. That must have been an incredible like jigsaw to put together, but I guess is also reflective of kind of the different things that are happening within the film at the same time.
Yeah, it was really exciting. And I actually heard from a friend of mine that, you know, inspiration for the film is the late filmmaker Pema Tsetin's work. And I think his later films, he would write them in, I don't know if he initially wrote them in Tibetan and then he himself translated them to Chinese, but he would work often with a Chinese script because, you know, of all of the people that need to read it, and that maybe being kind of, I don't know, the lingua franca or the most easily accessible for every individual. So really for myself, it not that it gave a sense of relief or anything, but it was kind of interesting to think about English or, you know, this triangle method of as something similar to get information across. Yeah,
definitely. We had a retrospective of his work earlier this year at the VIFF Centre, and yeah, incredible.
Well, I'm happy you went.
Yes. Yeah. And I guess kind of my final question on the film is filmmaking, or I guess like as we've kind of discussed, like that kind of filmmaking aspect that the main character discovers is such a central part of her plot development. And I guess it's difficult whenever you watch someone making a film, like recording something within a film, not to think about the filmmaker themselves. So I guess it's just like in the way that kind of Kunsel goes on this journey by discovering this video camera, like do you feel like that happened to you while making this film?
It was definitely a journey. Like it took a lot and it still is in this kind of, you know, I guess festival phase as well. It's been huge. So I can definitely, relate to that aspect of what it feels like to go through something kind of life-changing in a way. Yeah.
And you mentioned that you kind of drew inspiration from, or not drew, I guess with the Dukuti, there were similar systems in place in different communities. I guess as you've kind of been touring this film around different festivals, have you found that like different communities that aren't the Tibetan community have responded in certain ways? Have you found that there's kind of like these similarities across lots of different immigrant communities?
Definitely. I think, you know, I've had people tell me, oh, the Ishmaeli community also has something very similar, you know, Indian community, the Chinese community, like I think also Korean. So there has been a lot of kind of response to the financial collective money loaning system and maybe kind of like awareness or surprise that it really kind of exists within these various networks that can kind of be contained and live very isolated within, you know, the larger landscape of the country.
And I guess that kind of feeds back into the whole setting of the apartment complexes. Everyone's so close together, but still living completely different lives a lot of the time. Well, thank you so much for discussing the film. It's a really, really beautiful film.
Thank you.
I was so honoured to see it. And we just have a couple of questions that we're asking all of our filmmakers to end on. So the first of them is, what is your best memory of cinema or being in the cinema?
I think I first watched Avatar in New Delhi in 2009, and I believe it was like Eid. So when I watched the film, it was just the crowd in the cinema was going wild, and I think that was probably one of my favorite movie-going experiences.
There's definitely something about being with a crowd of people experiencing the same thing that kind of adds to your memory of a film or experience of a film, I guess. Yeah, I love that. And yeah, I can imagine Avatar. It's funny to think like back to when Avatar was first released and how huge that was now. Yeah, incredible. And then the second question is just, if you could pick a film to be in a double bill with 100 Sunset, what would it be?
I think I have two.
A triple bill.
I would be so honored and would love for either, you know, the late Pema Tsetin's film Jimpa to be double billed, or Hideaki Anno's Love and Pop.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and best of luck for all of your future endeavors and the future of this film.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the VIFF podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a review. Also, check out viff.org to learn more about what's happening at the VIFF Centre year-round.